Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. I am your host, Savannah. I'm usually found on the Female Dating Strategy podcast, but today I'm delighted to join the Queens over at the Red Light Exposé podcast to talk about the impact of the cost of living crisis and how this has been pushing more and more women into prostitution. So I'm delighted to be joined today. We have the wonderful Elly and Sybil Jo.
Hi, I'm Elly. I'm an activist against sexual exploitation in Germany. And despite what you might have been told, there is poverty in Germany and in quite a number of other countries, as we'll get into, where you think life is neat and stable, or as best as it can be to weather these difficult times. You know, the cost of living crisis is a global phenomenon, and we should be taking it seriously everywhere. And it very, very directly drives women into those industries. Yeah, we'll have a lot to talk about.
Hi, I'm Sybil Jo, and I am an exited survivor of the sex trafficking industry. I live in the Southeast US, and I am a local expert on what's happening in the trailer parks down here. As Elly said, it's not great in Germany, it's not great in the US, and I'm really excited to get to talk to you guys about what's going on.
And listeners, we have a few other episodes that complement this one. We previously did one very much focused on housing and the so-called sex for rent phenomenon. And as we were thinking it through, we figured, no, we have to go deeper into this. Housing is a big, big deal, but there's many things that people can't afford. There's still so many myths around poverty. It's just across the world, when I speak to people about prostitution, they always, I'm sure you've all experienced this, they go, nobody needs to be in this industry because anyone can be like a waitress or a cashier. And if you have one of those jobs, you're going to be all right. It might not be glamorous, but you're going to be okay. And nobody able to work, has to be poor. And it's really frustrating. It's like a, I guess, self-comforting myth that people need to tell themselves, because like really what we're going to be talking about a lot here is the working poor. You can work your entire life and, struggle to get by.
Absolutely. And the cost of living crisis, it impacts everybody, true, but there is also a disproportionate impact on women in the sense that, unfortunately, prostitution is seen as a viable career option if a woman is out of money. We have the sex for rent arrangements where, landlords are basically dangling the carrot of stable housing over young women's heads. We also have it where you see, like, if a woman says she's struggling for money, somewhere in the comments, there'll be something along the lines of, you can just start an OnlyFans. So we see this almost flippant suggestion that women should basically, have to prostitute themselves in order to make ends meet in a very, very difficult economic climate.
So before we dive into how all of this connects to sexual exploitation in more detail, it helps to put down some definitions. And prior to recording this, we had a bit of a chat, and each of us did some research, both for case studies and for understanding the broader dynamics, because even defining poverty is not that straightforward, right? And Sybil Jo, I know that you researched a concept all around this, how we have this idea of the poverty line and people below don't have enough to get by. But there's actually a really large group who are living just above the poverty line. And that is not sustainable, survivable either. Do you want to let us know more about that?
For a growing number of U.S. households, financial stability is nothing more than a pipe dream. No matter how hard the members work, these households are ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, employed, earning above the federal poverty level, yet struggling to afford basic expenses like housing, transport, food, childcare, healthcare, emergencies. I discovered this data, this ALICE data, asset limited, income constrained, and employed. These are working people, as you said, Elly, only 13% of whom are recorded as below the federal poverty line. But there's a 29% gap here when they studied the cost of living in areas in the United States. They discovered that although only 13% of households are below the poverty line, 29 more percent are above the stated poverty line, but still cannot afford these basic necessities. So that comes up to a 42% countrywide struggle to afford the basics, despite being overwhelmingly employed. And on their site, we'll put it in the links. It's unitedforalice.org. You can actually go down, they have a little map of the United States, and you can go to your state and you can go down to your county. I wasn't surprised to see on this map that in my region in the Southeast US, the percentages were a little bit higher. So around 43, 45% of households are below this ALICE line. It's a little better in the middle of the country. New York is comparable to the Southeast, but it's all around between 35 to 50%. 50% of households in Louisiana was the highest that I saw. So that's just under half of Americans who can't afford a basic living.
And that's just so sad, shocking, and just really, really frightening. Really frightening.
So that's like running out of grocery money by the middle of the month, or not being able to afford basic school supplies for your kids, never mind gifts and going out. The stats are not quite as bad over here in Germany, but when I talk to people who have to survive around the poverty line, to agonize over every purchase and things that many people take for granted, like a visit to the cinema, is something you afford once in a blue moon, something you need to save up for. And I think it's important for many people to understand that's the starting point for many women in prostitution. This is women who have worked often since they were teenagers, right? So this is like where the entire family needs to pitch in. You don't quite get a childhood because next to school, you also have to waitress or various other jobs that teens can get. Even though you're doing all that, it's not going to be enough. And so a number of women start to try and supplement that income through the sex industry just to get some breathing space. And we have this whole narrative of these are greedy women and they want to live the high life. For many women, we're talking, again, grocery money, gas money, school supplies, wanting to just take a day trip somewhere once in a while. That's what we're talking about.
All of those things, yes. But even below that, going back to the sex for rent, I knew these numbers, but it was very vindicating to me to see them in writing because I had only ever seen the government statistics, which I just knew were so off. The difference between 13% and 42%. That's a big difference. But I knew that and I've seen it. And so how are people surviving? We have this kind of story that people are surviving by working these retail jobs, restaurant jobs. You know, they have to work hard. They might have to work 2 or 3 jobs, but they're making it work. But that's not really what's happening. What I've seen is people are making it work either, like you said, through being channeled into prostitution directly or coming up with an arrangement with a landlord or being stuck in abusive marriages. There are family arrangements, you know, you're depending on family or you're depending on a church community. There's a lot of that here, which has its own toxic culture that women can get trapped in. Yeah, and so I guess we can start talking about the way that it's intentional. What I see with this, what's going on federally with the big, beautiful bill, which is increasing military spending, border security, and cutting Medicaid, cutting food stamps, which already were not serving anywhere close. Because again, first of all, you have to be in that 13% to access these services. So you have to be at the very bottom where there's a whole 42% of families there who can't even qualify for these services. And then they're cutting even more. I hear people who maybe come from different regions who sound like they're very shocked about what Trump is doing. And to me, it makes perfect sense because it's what I've seen generation after generation in my own family, this keeping women poor and forcing them to be dependent on domination-based communities. It's a business. It's not an accident.
I think it's also quite scary how the dependence almost on turning to prostitution for young women is now basically being seen or repackaged as empowerment. So the messaging that is coming out is that it's almost trendy to have a guy who's willing to pay your bills or a guy sending you money, but the conversation never really turns to what is actually involved in that exchange, because men don't send women money just for being pretty. They don't send them money just for existing. As much as women would like you to believe that's true, it is absolutely not true. There's always something that they expect in return. And like, as I've always said, like, liberation for women will never come on the end of a man's penis. It's just never worked out that way for any woman in history. It's also a concern for me, and it should be a concern for everyone else, that we are getting, young women who think they are the exception to the rules of patriarchy, almost sleepwalking into this prostitution trap. It doesn't guarantee their financial future, and it can actually limit their future opportunities as well, particularly if their faces all over OnlyFans, all over the internet, doing, X-rated content. And some of these sugar daddies, like, when the relationship ends, they can get very, very nasty very, very quickly. And the sorts of women who gets into these sorts of situations, they often don't have the social or the financial leverage to be able to protect themselves in a meaningful way as well.
Yes. So like Sybil Jo was saying, this is quite intentional. You have this parallel dynamic of erosion of social security, like across nations, with the big beautiful bill in the US, but austerity in many, many different countries. And at the same time, we're being told, oh, but there is this easy fix to female-specific poverty. Every woman has opportunity between her legs. Sorry to be graphic, but that's what they're saying. Savannah, you shared this article with us about sugar dating to afford living in London. Like, a lot of London residents can no longer afford the city, right? And you look at the kind of imagery on these sugaring websites, and they love doing this on the escort sites in Germany too, where they don't show a bunch of like greasy old men. It's like women in like pools, or like in the sun, or in like designer clothing, or just, what you would expect someone to look like on their vacation. Those kinds of images showing the young women. You almost never actually see a guy. And if you do see him, he's like vaguely in the background. We see that repackaged over and over, articles across publications, even in what you'd think would be like journalistic powerhouses. I've seen just interviews about women, buying cars and buying mansions and buying designer handbags. And if you're living in poverty, or you're living in Alice, turning over every cent, and then we get so mad when women fall for it. But we're doing this to them, like, on both sides. The poverty is intentional, and then the supposed easy exit from poverty is being pushed on like all fronts.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
Yeah, so we have a couple of case studies from around the world, so to speak. So I'm going to kick off with one from London. So this was an article that was released very recently, almost just under 2 weeks ago. And it talks about how young women in London are turning to sugar daddies to pay their rent. So I will give a bit of context to the economic situation in the UK. Basically, wages are going down, everything's going up. There is currently huge recruitment crisis. It can be very, very difficult to find a job, even more so if you are a young person or a university student, essentially starting out. Your options for earning an income is very, very limited. I started university almost 10 years ago now. If I compare it to what it is now, I had it very, very easy, even though I was still sort of counting my pennies. But the cost of everything has just absolutely exploded. The safety net in the UK, the social security, is very, very limited. You can only qualify for it in very, very limited circumstances. So what we have is almost a situation where it is unfortunately a palatable option for many young women, especially living in London, where the cost of renting a room in a shared house can very, very easily be £1,000 plus, to be falling into these situations, whereby they are being maintained in quotation marks, because I use that in a very, very non-literal way, because they have to give out so much in order for this relationship to be maintained. But anyway, and they end up on these sugar dating websites where they are looking essentially for a man to support them through the cost of living crisis. And we are seeing young women literally signing up to a website called What's Your Price? So literally putting a price on themselves so that they can basically find rich men who are looking to date them.
That name is so creepy. When I read that,
I know,
it's actually
I
called
know.
What's Your Price?
I know. And then people argue that it's not prostitution when it's literally talking about basically putting a price on your body for sexual purposes. Now, people love to compare, and I've said this before elsewhere, but people love to compare prostitution to a normal day job. But at least in the UK, if we're talking about sexual consent in the UK, one of the qualifiers for sexual consent being present is that it has to be freely given. Now, if somebody is having sex to pay their rent, then by definition, it cannot be freely given. This doesn't apply to other forms of consent. When you go to work and you're using that to pay your rent, if there's no sexual activity involved, yes, it's shitty, but it's not the same as sexual consent. And under UK law, if somebody is being coerced, if somebody doesn't have the freedom and capacity to make an informed choice, which is what we're seeing here, these girls are sleeping with these men under duress, they're sleeping with them to pay their rent, they're not sleeping with them because they actually want to engage in sexual activity with them, then consent is not present.
Yeah, Savannah, I think we've said several times on the show, the money is the evidence for the lack of consent. And in the
Exactly.
common narrative, they flip it. They say the money substitutes for consent.
And I was just going to highlight, right, we talked about Ellis, and I think we need to keep coming back to that there's so many groups of people whose poverty is not acknowledged because they're not at the absolute limit. That includes a lot of university students. And buyers of prostitution love to go, if she's a university student, she must be like middle class background, parents supporting her, she's going to be okay and she's going to have a future. So she's a real one of those hobby, insert an ugly word for women in prostitution. She must be a real hobbyist. They love, love, love that narrative. But university students or college students are a huge group of people whose poverty is not acknowledged. People make jokes about being broke in college, but it's not funny. I've over here in Germany also encountered women who said, it's like, I can barely make ends meet and I'm young. I want to live a bit and I'm considering entering the industry, or it's been suggested to me. It's just a big, big phenomenon. And it's just if people think, oh, this doesn't concern me, it's very much reached the middle class. If you think this doesn't happen to the middle class, it is coming, aside from the fact that the middle class is shrinking globally in many countries. And then people go, oh, just don't live in Berlin or London or New York. You can't afford it. Just don't live there. But that's where the universities are. That's where the arts are. If you want to be an artist, that was mentioned in the article, right? Performers, musicians, artists of all kinds. You need to be where the jobs are, where the exhibition venues are, and they are in the big cities. Are you supposed to commute 2 hours every day from some village outside of London?
And
right?
That's also expensive. People have family, they have friends there. It's such a flippant response. Okay, yeah, sure, I could have a much higher standard of living if I, lived in the Lake District. But the downside is I'm living in the Lake District. Where's the jobs? Where's my family? Where is the opportunities to progress? And, there's a reason why places outside London are cheaper. And that's because demand is lower, because it's not London, And also, it's just a case of, why should people be pushed out of the major cities because of just rank capitalism? That's also deeply problematic. Are we going to turn cities like New York, Berlin, London into a rich man's playground? Is that the end game here? Is that what we should be pushing for? Whilst everyone else lives in the villages and we just basically get the scraps of whatever is left? I don't understand that argument of just leave. And also, supply and demand. If everybody left London, as other cities are now finding out, guess what's going to happen to prices in these cities and villages? They will go up too. It's just a very poorly thought out solution for a really, really big problem.
You say, are we just trying to make a rich man's playground? And it absolutely is. These numbers, 50% of American households not able to meet their basic needs. Like you say, those people can't pursue activism. Those people can't unionize. It creates a permanent underclass. What are the other 50%? I know where I live, there's a lot of transplants from wealthier parts of the country who come here. So there's a lot of gated communities. The landowners need someone to work in their big house.
Speaking of men who want to make the world their playground, because we spend all our energy on the women in these situations. Honestly, every day I see people going like, these OnlyFans women and these sugar babies bringing down the West. And it's like, who made these platforms? I like to name and shame where we can. And we do know one particular man who is behind one of these big websites, the What's Your Price, which is still an insane name. Previously, he founded Seeking Arrangement, which I think is quite well known. And all of these sites like officially have to pretend they're not prostitution, that they're just dating. But on Seeking Arrangement now, you can either sign up as the attractive member or the successful member who displays their income. I was like, this is not very covert. And this was founded by a man named Brandon Wade. And just, this is a cursory look of his profile, but he struck me as like a rich incel. Like he was talking about how lots of men struggle to get dates and he tries to help them, but he's doing this for the rich men. All the money in the world, but your social competency is subterranean. And so you need a website to meet someone, but preferably someone 10, 20, 30 years younger. He's now married to a woman 30 years his junior. I have no tolerance for like these kind of age gap situations with men and women. It's just no. It's an old institution. It's now in the digital age. I mean, this is just modern concubinage, really. But you can now swipe through them and get rid of them more easily. And it's helping making this rich incel, it's just making someone like that even wealthier. And the fact that then there's people who see themselves as like lefty journalists going, this is wealth transfer to poorer women. This is like development aid. This is progress. This is opportunity. It's bizarre.
100%. 100%. And this is also why, as an aside, I think that, you know, feminism, radical feminism, or any other stream of feminism, there has to be an economic argument. There has to be an economic push to increase the minimum wage. There has to be an interest in providing a feasible social safety net for everyone. Because when we don't have these things in place, this is when women are susceptible to being pushed into prostitution in a way that men are just not. Yes, there are some male sugar babies around, but they are negligible. This whole sugar arrangement is primarily targeted at women, and that should be of great concern.
And let's be clear, like many of them don't even get anywhere near having their rent paid. They'll meet scammers and stalkers because there's no meaningful verification either for the attractive member or the successful member. So that can mean like any guy can fake his income and promise whatever. It also means just straight up traffickers can use the site for very regular prostitution of adults and minors. So there's at least one documented case of, I believe it was What's Your Price? But it could have been Seeking Arrangement, one of those, where a case went to court about a 13-year-old who was trafficked through one of these websites. So once again, the trafficking is not happening somewhere in some dark corner far away from all of this. It's using the same avenues as always.
Savannah, you said a minute ago, you know, how frightening it is, this kind of mainstream cultural narrative of sex work is work, and young women today, you know, the 20-year-olds right now getting fed this message. My kids get tired of hearing me say, I call our cell phones church in your pocket. And I say, it used to be you had to go once a week to the building where they would tell you how to think. And now who tells you how to think is right there in your pocket. As these cost of living crises get worse, and they will get worse, we had kind of a bubble here in my grandparents' time. They were able to buy a very modest, not even a house, a double wide, a trailer. And that was a big deal for my family. And that was kind of the bubble. And my mom was able to buy a house. And now it's kind of going back down to the really stark economic differences that we saw before. But the difference is in kind of old school patriarchy, and I've, talked to older women, they knew the deal. They knew you had to make the best deal you could, and there would be conversation, there would be advice. Older women would give advice to younger women about how to make the best deal for yourself. But now these younger women are being given advice on how to make the best deal for themselves by the pimps. There's this added layer of protection that has been really stripped away. And the difference between this generation coming up and maybe a generation in the 30s, we might get to this level of economic disparity, but the difference now is we're so insulated and atomized that young women aren't even going to hear protective messages. They're just getting fed straight from the pimp lobby, the narrative. Savannah, you said men don't give you money for being pretty. This is kind of a piece of advice that I'm talking about, like that an older woman would give to a younger woman. Oh, I know he's talking to you. I know he's giving you all of these tales of what he's going to do for you, but he's not going to do it for you just because you're pretty. And girls aren't being told that now. They're being told men will give you money if you're pretty. And the truth is, we need to have a permanent underclass because the landowners need someone to work in the big house. They also need someone to work in the brothels. The brothels or the kitchen or the fundamentalist cult, whatever group needs fresh, young, naive women. And the more women who are living without a living wage, without being able to meet their basic needs, the more they will be willing to do for what he's willing to pay. So he's not going to pay you for being pretty. And the things that he will pay you for are becoming more and more extreme as the market gets saturated, right, with these young, impoverished women.
Because the best way that you can exploit someone is if you convince them it's their benefit. Like,
Yes.
not you're getting exploited in a way that women have been for thousands of years. But what is new-ish is convincing you it's to your benefit. This is opportunity. This is you rising up in society. This is, and that's how they advertise the sugaring, meet somebody cultured and experienced and make connections. And these can be guys in the arts, or it can be guys in finance. Honestly, I mean, I've heard from survivors of sexual exploitation about human rights guys using all parts of the industry. So there's a lot of really horrific hypocrisy in that arena. My whole point is, you don't need a flesh and blood pimp if the culture and the cultural narrative, if they're the driver. And then when she doesn't succeed, or what they've told her is success, when that doesn't pan out, or maybe it does monetarily, but physically, emotionally, it's a downward spiral, then it's easy to have her blame herself. And our whole society then goes, you did it wrong. You weren't cut out for this. And we've talked about it many times. So if this is a task, or this is something you can win at if you apply yourself well enough and you're eloquent enough and you pick your sugar daddy or whatever carefully enough, then when it doesn't work out, it wasn't that this was systems set up to make you fail and hurt you and bleed you dry in every way. You're the problem. You made a mistake. You didn't follow some rule book. And then we can all go back to not caring about how you're doing and what resources you need and all of that.
100%. And we are also seeing from friends who I still have in the BDSM scene, we are seeing a rise of young women who are attempting to infiltrate the scene as a financial dominatrix. I'm not sure if anyone has seen the viral TikToks that are going around and the Findom scene on X, but it's basically where women are being told all you have to do is just be mean to men and they will send you money. And again, it's a different form of prostitution in that a lot of the women who are peddling this sort of thing to other women, they're often not honest about the extent of their involvement with these men. So a lot of them will post their sends, as they're called, or their tributes, and pretend like a guy just gave me £1,000 for existing, when actually they're a sex worker and they're posting their earnings, or they are manipulating how much they're receiving. So there's a whole slew of women now infiltrating the scene with very, very little understanding of what it means to be involved in BDSM, what it means to be involved in financial domination, and what it means to be involved in with these types of men. They are having a very, very rude awakening when they realize that it's definitely not easy money and it can be a deeply, deeply traumatizing experience. And some of them, unfortunately, also get scammed out of a lot of money as well, because they fall for these scammers who will say things like, I need you to send me $500 so you can get your payment of $3,000. Now, obviously, to you and I, that reads like a scam, but to a desperate young woman who really wants to make rent or just, wants to have a nice time, she'll think, yeah, that's a good exchange. And she sends the $500 and she never sees the guy again. We are also seeing an assault almost on women's ability to keep themselves safe because they're walking into very, very difficult situations that they don't fully understand without being given the proper context or guidance.
I don't know as much about the FinDom dynamic, but just hearing what you said, I think about financial abuse. When we're learning about domestic abuse and how it is so traumatizing to the mind, it feels like a Darvo situation where they're saying that this woman is a dominatrix and she's exploiting him for money when really she's the one that is desperate for the money and he's using it to exploit her. And it's just these layers of mind games.
And just the ultimate insult. What is abuse to you is a kink or a fetish for me. And I get a sexual thrill out of role-playing your trauma. But I have control because I can bow out of this anytime because I'm not actually dependent on my FinDom. That's just an act. Some things stay the same for thousands of years, but we keep finding new euphemisms for prostitution and new ways to funnel women in. I've had some contact with the FinDom phenomenon in the sense that I get men in my DMs on Twitter asking for this, and they specifically target feminist activists because the idea is you're all misandrists anyway, you love insulting men. And if I can convince you to take a bit of money, let's see what else I convince you to do. We call this sexual masochism, but I think there's a lot of sadism in the masochism. And this role-playing the abuse and trying to break someone down by pretending to be submissive. It's actually sadistic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this is what I mean about the Darvo. We understand in domestic abuse situations the way gaslighting works on the human psyche, the way that Darvo works to induce this kind of crazy making experience for the victim. But when it happens to women and they're getting paid, we call that abuse. I think, Elly, that we've talked about bum fights before. I'm not sure. Or I think I've heard you talk about the concept of, if anybody doesn't know, it's where somebody goes and finds some homeless people and gives them money to beat each other up. I was in a conversation with a friend of a friend at a gathering that really shouldn't have gone in this direction, but we got into the sex work is work conversation, and she was very rah-rah liberal and defending that argument. And I was like, oh, well, I'm very familiar with this. Let's talk about it. And as we got into it, I said, if I went up and I paid a homeless man $100 to let me punch him in the face, would you say that that was work, that was legitimate? And she thought about it and she realized that by her own logic, she would have to say yes. And she said, yes, I wouldn't stop that. And I said, you're lying.
Wow.
I did. I called her a liar to her face. I couldn't. No, you wouldn't. You would stop that. If you saw that happening, you would walk up and say, no, you cannot punch another human being in the face. Giving them $100 does not fix their broken nose. But we can abuse women, not just the physical acts of sexual abuse, but all of the abuse that is targeted because of our sex and because it is sexualized to the abuser. So these mental games are very titillating. I had a lot of quote unquote masochistic Johns back in the day, and you're absolutely right. The heart of that fetish is sadism. It's an enjoyment of being able to bend somebody else's reality like that.
Savannah, do you have some more thoughts on FinDom? Have you experienced men trying this? Because I can imagine with the female you're the meanest female only podcast on the internet, right? I would imagine that you get targeted in that way.
I mean, FinDom could be a whole episode in and of itself in terms of exploitation involved and just how it preys on both vulnerable women and vulnerable men as well. I wouldn't say that we've been targeted in that way because we make it quite clear in FDS our stance on BDSM, and we also make it clear that, again, liberation will never be found on the end of a man's penis, which is essentially what you are relying on. You are relying on a guy, finding you attractive enough and being willing to spend a lot of emotional and mental energy pleasing him, even though you are the dom in quotation marks. So it's not something that we've been exposed to, but it's always something that we would advocate against because, again, people position it as a position of empowerment, but it's a misnomer because ultimately you are still providing sexual gratification to men in exchange for money, which is the textbook definition of prostitution.
This is also just a cursory look, like Savannah just said, maybe will dedicate a whole episode to it at some point. But what I've seen, cursory look on Twitter, profiles of women in findom, it is a complete, mindfuck because you have to appear like you're in charge. You have to use insults and domineering language. But really, the entire Twitter threads are begging for money. Just repackage, just massive Darvo. These are women who really need money, but rather than saying, please, can you help me? And I mean, we've got this whole thing of people having to like beg for like their cancer treatment money or their dialysis money on crowdfunding. I mean, that is a whole indictment of our society anyway. In my opinion, this like begging for money in findom through Twitter or other social media, it's the same thing, just several deceptive layers of role reversal, but it's not really role reversal on top. So both the user and the woman in question don't have to feel it's begging and it's exploitation, but it is.
Yeah, exactly. And these men know this as well. They're not fooling anyone. They know exactly what the score is. And again, if you're not aware of the actual dynamics at play and just look at the surface, you can very quickly sleepwalk into a really, really difficult situation if you engage in such dynamic. And especially when you see, like I see on X, women who say I'm 18, 19, 20. And it's like, why are you trying to dominate men who are literally double your age? I can't think of an example where such a dynamic has ever worked out in the woman's favor in the long run. Again, I could do a whole thing about BDSM and almost like the double meanings of what they say. But if we are looking at it just from a purely findom point of view, it isn't a dynamic that you can understand at that age, especially when the men that you're interacting with are likely to be double your age. And some of them actually seek out younger doms purely because they don't know any better. And so they can exploit them.
I was about to say it's like, you age out of prostitution and then I had to correct myself because actually the story I'm bringing today is about how, yes, this industry loves to target the very young, but it can also get the elderly. In countries where the social contract, if there ever was one, always has been or really is now broken, sexual exploitation is something that can catch up or that reemerges in old age. And this is the only industry where the older you are, the more experience you'd have, the less money you make on average. And so the story that I'm bringing, it's a phenomenon that's happening in South Korea. I firmly believe this is not the only place it's happening. It's just a visible form of prostitution of elderly women. We're talking grandmothers, pensioners, women who've worked all their lives, paid or unpaid, often both, double burden. These are South Korean women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, sometimes 80s, who are engaged in street-level prostitution. And they are named after a popular Korean energy drink, the bakus, like the Roman god of merriment, wine, and madness. But it's a Korean energy drink. And the women stand on the street or they stand in public parks for hours and hours and hours. And they sell these little drinks and they start chatting to men and then they solicit. And the men pay somewhere between, so the won equivalent of $18 to $26, but it can go as low as $8 to then go to a hourly hotel and sexually exploit these women. And the reason it's happening is, like I said, the social contract, if there ever was one, is thoroughly broken in South Korea. It's one of the countries in the world with the biggest elderly population, the lowest birth rate in the world, but it has some of the worst pension systems. So the government is not looking after its old people, especially its women. And a lot of their children, they're either alienated from their children or the children themselves are struggling to get by because the young people are also barely making ends meet. And so to afford food and housing and things like arthritis medicine, this is what women are going through. Just to put it into perspective, half of South Korea's elderly live in poverty. This is under the poverty line. Like we said with the Alice, who knows how many are in that category? And this is especially bad for single elderly women. So that's 77%, which is an insane rate of overt poverty. This ideology, if you are not overtly, extremely being productive for a society, we don't care about you. You're not worthy. It's shown in the sexual exploitation, which is not one or two women, it's hundreds of women just in one park in Seoul alone. And it also shows in the suicide rate of that age group, which in South Korea is 3 times the OECD average. So this is, like we said, it happens to the 18-year-olds, but it can happen to the 81-year-olds. It's like, why isn't this a big international scandal? Like it is reported a few times in media, then they start blaming the children. Where are the children? Sorry, what about the state? What about the men with excess money? Because someone here has excess income, the men buying access to the women. But no, the intention is all like playing the kids against the parent. And then with young people's poverty, then it's the parents' fault, you know? I'm sure you've all seen the blame game. It's never the sexual exploiters and barely the government who gets the blame. It's like, sort out your family affair. And then we're back to like the exploitation as a private family matter and all of that. So there's a lot contained here. What are your guys' thoughts?
I'm just so horrified when you showed me these numbers. You know, it hurts me when this happens to young women, but I still have this hope and this faith that they can come out of it the way that many of us have. But to hear about grandmothers being exploited in this way and knowing that their opportunities are only going to deteriorate until a brutal death, that kind of breaks me on a whole other level. And in my own life, it's something that I've had to face and work with a lot of grief and despair and fear. My mother was living in poverty when she died. She was living in somebody's shed. Last year, I lost another older friend of mine. Not she wasn't old enough to pass, but you know, life had been so hard and she worked until her body couldn't anymore. I don't know, there's just something so paralyzing about this possibility for somebody's end of life.
All the focus should be on the men. What kind of man goes with a woman? I spent a year living in Japan, and I remember we had like an ethics class where the teachers asked us, you know, what are common values of societies? And then we had all this like, oh yeah, respect of the elderly. And even back then I was like, that's not true. We don't respect our elderly. Do you know how many of them are in poverty? Do you know how many of them are abused by their families? Do you know how many of them don't get sufficient care, etc.? And it's like like I said, like we only value very, very productive people. But even then, like you said, Sybil Jo, people can literally work themselves into an early grave. That's not enough. Like you need to be, I don't know, a programmer in Silicon Valley or an investment banker. I mean, it's insane anyway, which groups of working people we value. That's all messed up anyway, because obviously the care professions should be at the top. And other than doctor, they're not. Just the official narrative of we respect our elderly, and then even a cursory look at their actual living conditions. They say, South Korea, Confucian society, respect your elders, respect your parents. But it's like the inverse is true. And the men who take the women to the hourly hotels, like, don't you see your own grandma? Because some of them are older men, but some of them are the young men also, who get a kick out of the prices alone. I mean, on here, we all agree if you have to give somebody money, that's proof that there's no meaningful consent. But if I tilt my head a lot, I can maybe see how someone thinks if I pay a really high sum, it's somehow okay. But $20 on the street to a grandma who's been standing there for hours, who's struggling to walk, what kind of sadist piece of garbage takes up that offer? And then the journalists go, South Korean men work so hard and they're so lonely, and there's like a stigma for elderly dating. But the prostitution yos, they're doing that in broad daylight. That's okay somehow. All the dots on all of these things, they're not connecting if you follow the official narrative. None of it makes any sense.
I mean, for me, if I look at everything from the macro level, the consistency almost of the exploitation is something that really makes me sad. You know, when we look at Berlin, when we look at what's happening in Asia, because this isn't the only place where this is occurring. When we look at London, it runs the same thread throughout. Sometimes it just can get quite overwhelming when you see the similarities in women's exploitation cross-culturally as well. And it just goes to show just how prostitution, just because it's supposedly empowering for a dom from X from California. It's just not the case, because there is a persistent thread of exploitation that transcends culture, that transcends social class. And that's what really stands out to me.
Elly, what you were saying about respecting the elderly and this kind of gaslighting situation where this is what we say, but then when we look on the ground, poverty is an old woman living by herself, dying by herself. Like, I've seen it again and again and again and again my whole life. And you're like, it doesn't make any sense. Why are they doing this? Why do they need these grandmothers out there being treated like human garbage? Why do we need to see that in the streets? It goes back to what I was saying about women making the best deal for ourselves. In my culture too, the old patriarchy, there is this reverence for the mother, the grandmother, the matriarch, if you're in the right family. If you can find yourself a spot by serving, by following the rules, by being the good woman. And we need to see what happens to the bad woman at the end.
So it's like a big warning sign of this could be you, like, watch out, this could be you. But then when I speak to women, I kind of have to do the convincing of this could be you, because most of the time when I speak to women, if they haven't seen poverty, or maybe they've escaped it and they don't want to think about it anymore, there's like this need to convince oneself it happens to a certain kind of woman with a certain kind of personality, fiscal irresponsibility. I've spoken to a lot of people who are like, oh, people are born and they're prone to personality disorders or addiction, and it's largely on them to seek the right kind of help. There's so much discussed, and I didn't mention this, but for a while they were arresting these grandmothers. They have thankfully stopped doing that because they see it's not effective. That's where society goes first, like punishing the women and saying, she's over there, she's got nothing to do with me. I would never take the steps that have led her there. She veered off the path somewhere. That doesn't mean that maybe deep down we know actually it could happen. One bad marriage, one shitty job, one bad pension plan, one painkiller addiction. It disconnects there as well.
Yeah, and I do think that women have that awareness, and we feel that. We call it anxiety, right? We go to the psychologist and he gives us Valium for our anxiety. But that anxiety is this really deep down knowledge that if I don't do the right thing, I'm not going to get the support I need to support myself. And going back to the men aren't going to pay you for just being pretty. And the more women they can make an example of, the more they can go and say, like, hey, you're a very reasonable woman. You're very smart. Here's the deal I'm going to offer you. And a lot of women will pick it up because they do know that the alternative is, I'm going to slip in this way, I'm going to slip in that way. And then it becomes a domino effect. I do think that we have an awareness, even if it's unconscious, and we're acting from that. I know I have.
Yeah, really well said, both. I agree.
And just if we need any more evidence that all these different phases of prostitution are not a wealth transfer from the rich to the poor, it's very simple. Like, these types of systems have existed for thousands and thousands of years. If it actually changed the economics, we would have been like mega egalitarian, whatever, 2000 BC, right? We would have been in paradise, considering like how much sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation happened. Clearly, it doesn't mean that the argument dies. It's so popular. It's really creepy. I see it in academia when I read papers. You have these sociologists going to places like South Korea. And obviously, they would call these grandmother sex workers or elderly sex workers. I once read a paper about men struggling with heroin addiction in street prostitution in Vietnam. And somebody went, this is an opportunity for them to learn English from the so-called sex tourists. Whatever situation you have, you can find some sociologist who will bend it and twist it into economic opportunity and development aid. That whole idea just needs to die a really, really quick death. And we need to band together rather than look with disgust. I also see a lot of elderly people collecting recyclables. I'm sure you have this in your country. Like, there's an entire, we speak about the working poor, the working elderly poor. We should all be banding together. Prostitution has so many functions to maintain the current system, one of which I just quickly want to highlight before we might turn to some more solution-oriented parts of the discussion. I said men who buy access to women of all ages have excess income. I think that's generally true. However, sometimes they're low on money too. And rather than like going to the cinema or, just getting a normal massage, they go to the brothel to like splurge on themselves, treat themselves, because they've been told that a man who's made it in society, he can use somebody. And that undermines solidarity. And that's what, the socialist feminists or the communists, they used to write about this. It undermines class solidarity between working class and poor men and working class and poor women. And it really does, because you cannot see yourself as a unity when one half is doing that to the other. And I gave a presentation not that long ago on the different philosophical schools in feminism, right? Radical feminism, liberal feminism. And then socialist feminism is like really marginal today. It's not a big movement. But looking at where we're heading, I just kept thinking we need a desperate revival of a feminism that's all about economic stability and building networks to help people when they fall through the cracks, when the government fails, when the family fails. And it's not there right this moment, or barely.
No, I'd agree with that. And we can't take feminism for granted, even though we've made great strides over the years. But there is also this push for, prostitution as empowerment is part of the backlash to feminism that is coming at a different angle. So from the right wing, you have the promotion of the trad wife lifestyle. Then from the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the positioning of, prostitution as empowerment. And it's just another form of pushback against feminism and women's rights.
Yeah, my big concern is like we were saying earlier, these younger women, we have to keep educating and keep talking. If we don't tell the truth about these systems, and we have to do it over and over and over again, and it's so exhausting. Every generation, we have to tell it again because they're getting just force fed this other narrative. And if that's the only narrative that they get is this can work for you if you're smart and savvy enough, these young women just don't have the experience to know where these light prostitution channels lead to. It's a frog in the boiling water thing, right? And if we don't build these communities where we can tell them the truth, and they'll just get siphoned into it.
So none of us here are economists or experts on how to fight poverty and really the ongoing transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Well, money from the poor to the rich. But there's a variety of things that can be done. And it starts in our personal lives. If we look out for our friends and family, where we're heading, it's about who do you know to weather the storm, the coming storm, or the storm that's already here for many people. And to, get rid of the idea that the people I know who are struggling, they must have done something wrong, to get off that easy narrative and reevaluate that. I recently read a book that I think, speaking of female poverty specifically, it gave the advice of, for most women, modern romantic relationships are in a variety of ways unsafe or at least unstable, and making any kind of financial plan around a man is not a viable strategy. But that doesn't mean that you can't plan with other people. And like the book made the case for, if you're gonna buy or start paying off a property, do it with a good friend or two. If you're going to move to a new place, don't do it for a boyfriend, but move to the town where your friend lives, to be in proximity with each other for many nights over for fun, but also for when one of you needs support, be that moving, be that a medical crisis. We talk about the sex work propaganda. We do know there's a romance propaganda also. People ask me all the time, oh, what about marriage? What about marriage? We'll touch on it now and then, or we might do a dedicated episode on the marriage prostitution overlap. Aside from all the sex work propaganda, all the romance movies that go, if you just bag a good man and you marry him, you're settled for life. That's almost never true. If he's very, very wealthy and you have a very good prenup and it just goes bad, but it's non-traumatizing, okay, maybe. But for everyone else, maybe we even need civil partnership for friends. It's an idea. Governments barely want same-sex marriage. I'm sure they're not ready for friendship, like legal obligations between friends or something. Okay, but we can do that. We can do some of that informally with people who have been with us for decades sometimes, and let go of some of that romance propaganda as well as the sex work propaganda. So those are just my 2 cents on things that we can do here, even while the world is going crazy.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just to keep sounding the alarm, really, and to also create a space where women aren't shamed if they feel forced into prostitution as well, because whilst there is sometimes an element of choice, but there are also lots of economic and external factors.
And it's just like with relationships, okay, maybe she chose the guy, but she didn't choose the trauma. She didn't choose who he turned out to be.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
The blame game just keeps us divided. It doesn't help.
Yeah, Elly, what you said about really hammering in this message that finding financial security through a man. You said we keep coming up with new names for this arrangement. The arrangement being a young girl is very poor and very inexperienced, and she's learning about the world, and she's given what seems like a good deal. And if nobody's ever explained to her what the deal really is, then of course it looks like a good deal. What you said about it starts in our personal lives. Yes, we're out here, doing activism, we're out here giving speeches, but what you said about getting together with other trusted women, having these conversations, telling the truth to each other, and then doing something about it. That's the positive side of it. Investing in community structures that don't have anything to do with your sexuality, and also setting boundaries in our normal lives in front of young women. I try to be very careful any workplace that I'm in. I work in kitchens, and kitchens are rowdy sailor type places, and there's a lot of sexual harassment, and there's a lot of boundary pushing. And it's very important to me that the younger women, my coworkers, hear me say, no, that's not okay. No, we don't do that. Because if they don't hear other women telling the truth about these boundary pushing behaviors, they won't know how to recognize it. A lot of women who haven't experienced it don't want to face it, but some younger woman is watching them and taking their word for what reality is. And if we don't start telling the truth, we're handing our children and our grandmothers to the pimps.
For those of us who might not have someone in our lives right now who's able to show us how to set boundaries, I do wholeheartedly recommend the female dating strategy. You can get some collective female wisdom online, right? It used to be a subreddit, but there's still a website and a podcast that Savannah and several other brilliant women are running, women from across continents communicating, sharing the knowledge. It's all about focusing on female, well, not just survival, but benefit. And like, I really like how it's a dating podcast, but it's about so much more. It's not about how do I put on the right dress for the man or the right perfume or say the right things. It's I need to be solid and connected and good in life. And then romance is optional and it's careful. And I check back in with the people who know me, whether they get the feeling that I'm in a good place, and I learn about my boundaries, I practice them, I find out what I really want. I think you're real pioneers in that arena that we really need. And just to say thank you for that. I personally know multiple women who it has helped to get out of bad situations and go to better places in all parts of life. Yeah.
And even if you're not in a bad situation, anytime I'm feeling depleted or, I need some confidence boost, I can just binge a couple of episodes, even if I've already heard them, and just the energy that they bring. And again, telling the truth about what the deals are, it clarifies your mind. It's not a confidence of, oh, I'm so cool, I'm a bad bitch or whatever. It's, I know what's what. I know the ground under my feet. I can take the next step. Thank you, Savannah. I've been a big FDS fan for years.
Thank you both. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We really, really hope that it sheds some more light on the cost of living crisis and the push into prostitution for young women. Let us know what you think, and we will see you again soon.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.